Okay, let's get started. Hello and welcome to the Bay Area Council's Bay Area Impact Webinar Series, and thank you for joining today. I'm Jim Wunderman, President and CEO of the Bay Area Council. I'm honored to host a conversation with Kathryn Wylde, a good friend who is President and CEO of the Partnership for New York City, to discuss the shared challenges and opportunities of our two regions. So we should have a really great conversation today. Welcome, Kathryn. How are you doing?
Thank you. I'm doing pretty well, I think, although none of us know the COVID is creeping up on us.
Yeah, it really is. And I guess both coasts are probably equally affected by this. And it's really, some crazy things seem to be happening all at the same time. So, we're definitely going to touch on this subject and, which seems to be the major overriding subject of our time, COVID and what it's doing to us and what we're trying to do to it. So talk a little bit about what New York is experiencing at this point. I know things have been sort of changing quickly there.
Absolutely. And in the last couple of weeks, I'd say we've really lost some momentum. We had, in September, the president came out with guidance and a mandate on private sector employers to be effective in January. And it was a combination of vaccinations and testing. And most private sector employers were good with that approach, our large employers, and put in place last summer and in the fall, put in place practices that basically for people coming into the workplace or who have to be in the workplace, 100% vaccinations or testing. And that had, and we were mask free as of September. So that was working out pretty well. Life was going back to normal. Our restaurants were checking vaccine IDs. And so in public gathering spots, the theaters, Broadway, et cetera, they had worked it out so that they had a pretty good system. We have in the last 3 weeks had mandates from the mayor calling for all private sector employees in the workplace to be vaccinated and no testing alternative, which really boxed folks in. About most of our major employers, Wall Street, financial services, technology companies, they're mostly 95 to 98% of their people are vaccinated, but the few are always the issue. And so we've got until December 27th for 100% of the people in the workplace to have their first shot. Yeah. And that's a pretty tough mandate from the mayor, and there are questions about whether it's legal or not, but right now we're stuck with it. And no testing option. No, that's the key part here. There's no testing option.
Yeah, well, it's, I think both New York and the Bay Area have done generally well on vaccinations, which is good, but can always be more. And I know our organization put out a rare edict, of course, with no power, no authority, saying to our members, you really need to get people vaccinated. And it helped at one point, increase the number, rather a lot, because when people actually care about their jobs. So when it comes down to it, a lot of people are willing to get vaccinated. But we're also seeing companies running up against deadlines. Are you having the same thing where a company puts out a deadline, you must be vaccinated or you're going to get fired, and then it hits the date, and what happens then?
Not so much. We don't, the Great Resignation has discouraged firing threats. And so we haven't really, the pressure has come from government because our economy and our subway system, et cetera, are all suffering from the lack of people, from remote work, and from the fact that we're an economy that is so driven by commuting into Manhattan in the morning and commuting somewhere else at night, that's the whole Manhattan small business sector and the whole commuter rail and subway system have suffered enormous losses of revenues. And we've still got throughout Manhattan, it's really in worse shape than any place else in the city. Our central business district has many boarded up stores and no foot traffic, and that's been the real problem. And that had just started to come back, and we had about 30% of the population coming back like by November, and now it's fallen off again with this new scare in terms of people coming back to the office. So that's the problem.
Yeah, just what we all needed. And, of course, here we're in the same shape. We're not quite as transit dependent as New York City, but we're right, we're one of the next regions in the country that is. And, our BART system has been hovering somewhere in the 20s when it comes to pre-pandemic, 20% pre-pandemic ridership and so forth. And,
well, we're a little better. We're about 43% on
yeah,
the
no,
subways. And the buses are down about 35%.
Yeah, so yeah, the buses do better because they take care of people more kind of local travel as opposed to commutes. But
and of course, bridge tolls are in great shape.
Yeah, the bridges are doing just fine, right?
The cars are coming in.
Yeah, we're at 100% of pre-pandemic bridge traffic.
We are too. Same thing.
We need to figure out how to get those people back to transit, but it's not obviously not an easy thing to do. What's the strategy in New York for doing it? Are you communicating with folks and encouraging it, or what do you do?
Implementation of congestion pricing in the Manhattan Central Business Districts is still on the table. This is something we've been working on for a number of years. We started in 2007 arguing that it's costing us $20 billion a year, traffic congestion, excess traffic congestion. We got to do something about it. So 2 years ago, we got the state legislature to enact a congestion pricing program for Manhattan. And we finally, it took, we were stonewalled in the Trump administration on approval, a new tax, so we finally have gotten approval since our in the last year, but the pandemic has slowed up the process of implementation. So we're hoping that within the next year we will finish the environmental approvals and finally be able to put a congestion pricing strategy in place. And that's really the only way we're going to cut down on the traffic in Manhattan and get people to do a modal shift.
So you were working on that, and for a business group to be pushing for congestion pricing, as you said, a new tax is it's not common, and obviously exists in other places in the world, in places like London, and it's often talked about here. But talk about, why you took that step, because you did that before the pandemic.
Yeah, we've been arguing for it since 2007, and actually was on Mike Bloomberg's agenda when he was mayor, but we couldn't get it through the state legislature. Finally managed that 2 years ago. So the reason is we did an analysis and essentially found that excess traffic congestion was costing the city and mostly the business community over $20 billion a year. And people were just, the loss of productivity and the delay and the loss of time. And we have good public transit alternatives. So these are not necessary cost losses. And that was the whole push. So from the business community standpoint, this was really designed to make the city more efficient, more productive, to save money, and to make sure we are really investing in and utilizing our mass transit system to the maximum extent possible. And environmental reasons, because obviously cars are polluters. We actually in New York City, our biggest polluter is buildings, not cars, because we have such density. But cars are an important contributor, and trucks are an important contributor, and it was just inefficient. So and still is. Actually, we're back to the same mess.
Yeah, it's really amazing to see this switch back to single occupant vehicles after all of work we've done to try to discourage people from doing that. And it's going to take, I think, a pretty Herculean effort. So, congestion pricing, I guess, is, it's, I know this, the Board of Supervisors in San Francisco, who usually is the one who passes something that you tell me to keep your stuff on the West Coast. Now
Yes.
you guys are doing it. So remember, it's a two-way street here.
Well, again, we see this as a pro-business strategy. The problem will be we have yet to establish what the amount is going to be to drive in. So New Jersey, the Democrats in New Jersey are suing us, the governor and the congressman, because they say, well, why should we have to pay to drive in our workers that have to go there? We've got, so everybody wants an exemption. And you start giving exemptions and you haven't accomplished anything. So our fight ahead of us is still to say what the price will be and to hold the line on no exemptions. Everybody's hospital patients want exemptions and small businesses want exemptions. The whole key to congestion pricing is no exemptions. Everybody pays.
As a former, born and raised New Yorker, when I come to visit, I want an exemption. And you must know somebody you can say
online
for me. I was wondering about, the thing we talk about a lot, at least we've been talking about ad nauseum, is return to work. So, we've been interviewing our member companies to discuss what their plans are so that we can get a hold, because, right now, if you're in the financial district in San Francisco or South of Market, it's an amazing thing to see how empty it is. And it's disconcerting. And, you mentioned the boarded up, what else do you do when you have no customers? Then to board things up. And then we've gotten some of these flash robberies, and we're going to talk about crime in a bit. But what are you finding are the plans of companies for, how many are already gotten their people back, and what are their plans for post New Year, and, how many days a week and that sort of thing? Because this is something that's, critical for our economies is, how do we, what do we plan for here? How do we plan for it?
So about 80% of our companies on our surveys, as of this fall, 80% of our companies are saying they're going to some kind of hybrid model, which means 3 days in the office, 4 days in the office, but it is not 5 days in the office. And the estimates are that by the end of January, and this is again subject to the COVID conditions, but by the end of January, that on the average day, 50% of people will be in the office. Now, probably pre-pandemic, we never surveyed this. It was probably 80% pre-pandemic because people are on business travel, a lot of professional services, et cetera. So it wasn't 100% that were in the office every day. But this is a big change. And obviously the real estate industry is apoplectic about it because it means vacant space. And a lot of, we've got over a 20% commercial vacancy now rate, which is unheard of, because people are giving up their space, even at cost where they have leases. Companies are giving up their space because they don't see any way that they're going to reuse it. On the other hand, a lot are investing in creating more interesting, attractive, user-friendly spaces. I imagine you're doing the same thing.
Yeah, we're seeing that. Certainly it's not as if there's no pipeline for activity, but there's not a lot of activity toward building new buildings. So we don't have much. There's a little bit, but there's not as much as
interesting on that. We've got a lot of new buildings going up and a lot of new offices coming online, and they're renting like mad. A lot to West Coast companies. I mean, the biggest investments here in real estate are coming from Google, Facebook, Amazon. Sorry about that.
Well, they're the same here.
Okay.
Okay.
So they're everywhere.
We're glad to share. And on that note, it was a personal gift that we sent Steph Curry over to Madison Square Garden to set the lifetime 3-point record. So I hope, and we like to share with New York what we can. So Google, Facebook, Curry, those kinds of things. But we want something in return. So it's always tit for tat, quid pro quo.
Well, we've got some people we could send you, but
I know you
we
do.
won't call names.
Well, we'll talk about this as well as how, what are the ways we actually, see there's a lot in common, there's differences, but there's a lot in common between these two places and economies and tax structures. And, from a federal standpoint, what makes sense for New York and California and the Bay Area, it doesn't always make sense for the rest of the country, but we have some common things. And, maybe something we could talk about is how we, more about how we work together.
Well,
A lot of history to that.
One that is a big challenge is the loss of state and local tax deductibility. And New York and California, Massachusetts, Illinois, I mean, the 11 states that have the biggest losses as a result of losing the deductibility of state and federal taxes from your state and local taxes from your federal income tax bill. The biggest states are New York and California. I can't remember your number in California. Ours is $12 billion a year in discretionary income that we're sending to Washington.
Yeah, it's a little above that here, but it's
yeah. You're number one in the country, I know.
Yeah.
Congratulations. We like losing to you on this one.
Yeah, I know.
But it doesn't look like they're, I don't know how it looks from from the West Coast, but here it feels like they're not going to get a reconciliation bill through. We were hoping for, and Senate Majority Leader Schumer, our guy, was leading the fight along with Nancy Pelosi on the House side to try and get us restoration of state and local tax deductibility. It looks like the best we're going to do is get a lift on the cap. And maybe some combination of a lift on the cap and some increase in income restrictions, so that, I mean, they're saying that folks that earn under $400,000 could take deductibility, but those that are, it's more punish the wealthy stuff.
Yeah, that's a lot of that going around in there.
So, but it doesn't look like they're going to pass a reconciliation bill. At least it's a tough slog on the bill.
Not as of today. I guess they have to convince that rather moderate senator out of West Virginia, seems to have some issues with what's there, and another in Arizona, and I don't know.
Well, I'll tell you
better
something.
A few days ago, and now it doesn't look so good.
Well, I'll tell you something scary in the bill. I saw numbers on what it would do. It will make New York New York City residents the highest tax residents in the country, and the number in terms of our effective tax rate, federal, state, and city, will be 66% of your paycheck.
That's amazing. Yeah.
Yes, it is amazing.
Yeah. Well, it's something's got to give, and if you give, you should get back. And we made the point from the beginning with Speaker Pelosi and others, that we really need this relief. It's not fair to states that are like ours, that are contributing so much to the federal budget, that that there's this major taking that took place in the previous administration. But, there's only so many states that are, part of the lobby for it. And we happen to have leadership, which is to our advantage. And there's some obvious sensibility around it, but I don't know. We keep hammering away on it. I know that you do too. And, right, those things are certainly in common. What about, the bill that did pass on infrastructure? So there is new funding coming through. I saw that, I guess New York reached some agreements on some new tunneling under the East River, as well as a new international terminal out at JFK. So how do you see that package benefiting New York City?
Yeah, the infrastructure package we're very excited about. We think that's going to be a benefit both to mass transit, as you mentioned, to our airports, and to helping for access, the rail access. This is Amtrak service, and under the Hudson River between New York and New Jersey, what connects us to Manhattan to the rest of the country. So we certainly support that. We're looking forward to it, and we're hoping will be effective in in putting that to work relatively quickly. Also, the energy and resiliency stuff in there is very important to New York, because we have set, as I'm sure you have too, given that you're California, we have set very ambitious goals for ending our carbon emissions, going to zero net emissions by 2050 and staggered, with interim goals up to that, and to make our buildings in Manhattan, in the whole city, that buildings will have to be carbon neutral by 2030, which is an equally ambitious plan.
Yeah, very.
It means going to renewables at a pace that, particularly since we closed our nuclear sources of energy, so we now have to go to renewables for all our new energy. This week, our city council passed a law that no new building built in New York can have gas. So we've gotten, at least our politicians have gotten very serious about this.
Yeah.
And the question is there going to be enough wind and solar and hydropower to make up the difference?
Yeah, well, a number of the cities in California and some in the Bay Area have done that, and it's certainly a growing trend. And it's a real question. Ever since we passed the Global Warming Solutions Act that Governor Schwarzenegger signed way back in 2006, which set out goals, and what the legislature and governors that came after us, they just tightened, just kept bringing back the dates that the goals had to be hit, as well as the amounts that had to be achieved. And we have the California Air Resources Board as a, very sort of a unique agency, I think, in the country that has incredible power to set standards in just about everything. I'm the chair of the regional ferry system called WIDA, and they basically told us we can't operate any more boats that require anything that aren't zero emission. So we have to base our future fleet on zero emission ferry boats. There's only one problem. There really aren't zero emission ferry boats that have been tested in the kind of water that, the waters that, like San Francisco Bay, which are choppy with, really strong currents. Nevertheless, that's what we're agreeing to do is we have brand new boats on order. We haven't even received them yet, and they're out of compliance with what we've been ordered to do. So we may have to, maybe we can sell some of those to you or Seattle or somewhere, but it is
We have choppy water
challenge. But then again, it's all part of the mission of addressing climate change, and it does generate an industry, which we certainly have here, in which there's tremendous amount of investment and thought leadership and companies springing up all over the place that are addressing one part or another of the climate change challenge. So being a leader in it, has its economic advantages. At least we seem to be relying on that, and we've got a lot of great examples of companies that have sprung up as a result of this, and they attract a lot of very, very smart people. I'm sure that the same thing is happening in New York.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have nuclear or not?
So we have one operating nuclear facility in California called Diablo Canyon on the Central Coast, and it's PG&E owns and operates the facility, Pacific Gas and Electric, and they've announced a few years ago that they weren't going to go for relicensure. And I think it's about 1/7 of our power that we create in the state. And obviously it's a zero emission facility. So I'm wondering if we shouldn't question that and see if we can revisit it for the reason that you put forward. It's going to be really tough to achieve these goals and lose that nuclear power at the same time.
Certainly during the next decade or two of transition, to be losing nuclear as a source is, I think it was a huge mistake here. It was a big chunk of our New York City power supply. And we cut it off, and now we're saying, and now we're cutting off gas and not allowing any new fossil fuel infrastructure at all to be built. So we've just approved building a transmission line to bring Quebec's hydropower into the city. But that's going to take a while to get built. But otherwise, we're thinking wind farms are going to keep the lights on, and it's just unclear, since there's no we don't really have in this country demonstration that that's a practical way to solve the energy problems of a large city.
Speaking of wind, let's talk about politicians. So you're seeing a fair amount of, and we'll get back to this. And we have some questions popping up, and I'm going to get to those in a little while. But you've seen a fair amount of political change going on in New York City and New York State, obviously with the resignation of your governor.
Some through elections and some not.
Yeah, some through elections and some through other means. And we all watched that. It was very, very entertaining. But so you've got a gubernatorial election coming up in a year, and you had a mayoral election in which Eric Adams was elected, and he's going to be replacing Bill de Blasio. So how do you see this affecting the economy and the business community? What's the general state of things you think for New York, given the political activity that's going on there?
So we had our mayoral primary in June, and for the first time, we again copied you and did ranked choice voting.
Right.
And actually, as you predicted to me, that worked out very well for us. It was new for New Yorkers, but we had a good turnout in the primary election. We worked hard to get a larger electorate, and about 250,000 more people voted. We had the most voters out since 2003. And the turnout elected under ranked choice of the three top candidates. The one who came in third was the far left candidate and got the hardcore left primary vote, which is about 30% of our primary vote is hardcore left. But choices number 1 and 2 were the very moderate candidates in the race. Number 1, in a year of defund the police, number 1 is a guy who was on the police force for 22 years, Eric Adams, and was finished up there as a precinct captain, was briefly a Republican during his tour in the state Senate. He came in number 1, and 7,000 votes behind was Kathryn Garcia, who's a technocrat who was the city sanitation commissioner and was also not ideological, very professional. So we saw in our primary election really a rejection of the democratic socialists and the defund the police people, and say, wait a minute, we've got public safety problems, we've got a whole slew of problems, we need fixers, regardless of their ideology, politics. That's not what we're looking for. We're looking for people to fix stuff. And de Blasio for 8 years was a very ideological mayor. It was tax the rich and blame landlords for everything that goes wrong, and et cetera. So from the business community standpoint, and I think from the standpoint of most New Yorkers, this is a real relief that in the city we have a mayor who wants to work with the private sector and in a constructive way, not demonize them, but to try and work with them to fix our serious problems. And in part, this is, after 9/11, we had 9/11 occurred on our primary day in 2001, and going into that primary, the primary had to be canceled. Going into that primary election, no one thought Michael Bloomberg, a Republican, would ever be elected mayor of New York. But 9/11 was such a shocking and difficult experience. They said, screw it, we don't care about your politics. We want somebody who can manage the city. And the same thing really has happened again in the face of the COVID, which has had such an impact. People really are saying we want, and at the state level, Governor Hochul, who was lieutenant governor, came into her office from the side door when Andrew Cuomo was forced to resign in August. She came in, but she so quickly established herself as a common sense fixer of problems that and non-ideological, that her major competition has dropped out of the race as of last week, and she's got a pretty clear path as a moderate to be elected the first elected woman governor of New York State. which will happen in June. Again, we've switched our primaries to June. So I think that from the standpoint, again, of business, and we want problem solving at this point in our society. And that's what we have in our mayor and governor. So we're pretty happy. How about you in California?
Well, we're happy to see what's happening in New York because there are some, consistencies between the two. And, I and our group and other groups around this very large state are really beginning to coalesce around the notion of, pushing for a moderate agenda, which has been missing in action in California and in our major cities. So what we're seeing is, what you described as, kind of attack the wealthy, figure out what tax you can do, double it and go out there, see what you can get. This has sort of been the territory that's been established, and it causes a tremendous amount of conflict. And we have initiatives in California, so we end up with ballot measures that end up costing $50 to $100 million to defeat. The ones that were put on the ballot in November 2020 were all defeated. So there was success at a great price, but in a defensive kind of way. So what we're trying to do is recalibrate, how, I think at a time like this, people don't want these kind of harebrained schemes if they can understand. They really want sensible, common sense leadership. I think that's what you're seeing. That's what we want. The governor is kind of a common sense leader, but the legislature pushes, has him pushed way to the left. So that's a challenge that we have. We have a one-party system now in California. The Democrats control over 75% of both houses of the legislature. And so, there's no response anymore. So it's a question of how far left. And, the Bernie Sanders won the primary in the presidential election. So it just gives you a sense of the challenge that we face, but we're definitely facing. And here in San Francisco, we saw Mayor Breed come out the other day and say something I think a lot of people were waiting for. People are really kind of fed up at the situation on the streets and the flash mob robberies that have occurred. And she said, enough bullshit. We need to start fighting crime again. And there's a recall going on in San Francisco against the sitting district attorney, Chesa Boudin, who ran on the platform of criminal justice reform, not crime fighting. And then in Los Angeles, George Gascon, the former district attorney of San Francisco, who came from LA, is now the district attorney in Los Angeles County, and they're having fits in LA. And I was down there last week, and the only thing that makes me feel better about San Francisco is being in LA. And it doesn't make me feel good because LA is really important, but it's scary on the streets, and people in LA and in the Bay Area, I think, are really worried about safety. And so so we have to change that. And I think the public is beginning, I think Mayor Breed's comment, and also last week, Mayor Schaaf in Oakland called on the governor to send in the, help, with hot California Highway Patrol officers. And, they're having a terrible time, way up in homicides and gun, regular gunplay in Oakland. So, we're seeing these liberal mayors say, enough is enough, and they're obviously reflecting the angst of their constituents. I'm wondering, I saw commercials that say New York is safe and you should come to New York because it's a safe place. And I see some really nice commercials about New York that warm my heart, but I'm wondering how is it really, and how's the homelessness situation? And, do you feel things have things in hand, or, because we're not as much in touch with it, and would be curious to see how New York is dealing with that.
Yeah, no, New York is, I forget what you call those motorbikes that ride through the streets, but you can have 50 of those illegal bikes. They're not bikes, they're like motorcycles, doing wheelies coming down Fifth Avenue. So there has been a sense of lawlessness. The police started to get control of that this fall. It had been, like police on strike since we had all the anti-police. But after Eric Adams won the primary, things got a little tighter. But our general crime is up 5%. Major crimes are up 5%. Now, we're nowhere near what we were in the 80s and early 90s. So we're not, there. But the perception, and especially because this is concentrated in Manhattan, because we have so much fewer people on the streets, you've got fewer eyeballs, and you've got more opportunity for crime than we've had before. And so there is a problem, and our biggest problem is shootings. And you guys would be interested in this. We've got this Supreme Court case. New York has a law that we've had on the books for years against concealed weapons, which is being challenged against carrying. It requires special permits to carry concealed weapons that are very strict. So when you're riding the subway, you don't have to worry about somebody who's got a gun concealed under his thing. They're not legally. But that's being challenged in the Supreme Court. And based on the initial arguments, it looks like we may get a decision that invalidates that state law against concealed weapons and against managing that. And we've already got a huge shooting problem where shootings are much higher. I forget the number, but I think it's 150% higher than they were in the last pre-pandemic. So we've got a huge illegal gun problem. And if that Supreme Court thing goes through, it's going to get much worse, because we won't be able to stop people who are coming into the state carrying concealed weapons and bringing weapons in. So it's the crime situation is serious. Again, that's, I think Eric Adams, our mayor-elect, was elected to fix that, and we'll see in a couple of weeks, January 1st, he takes office. We're certainly all behind him in terms of fixing that problem, and he believes he can do that without causing racial unrest. He's not going to go back to stop and frisk, et cetera. He's got a balanced approach on that. So we're very hopeful. He appointed a new police commissioner, first woman police commissioner in New York City, this week. And she says guns are going to be her #1 issue. We're going to, roll back this problem. So if that happens, if they get control, it'll be great. And homelessness, we're not in good shape. We don't have tent colonies of families camping out, but we do have single, mentally ill, substance abusers, very much concentrated around our major transportation hubs, in our subways, a lot more harassment of people, and there's a fear of enforcing the law because of the whole anti-police thing. And also we have court cases that allow them not to arrest somebody unless they're a danger to themselves or the public, and that becomes a subjective decision. So that's our homelessness problem, is that.
You have a right to shelter law on the books, which we don't have, which entitles the city to kind of make, sort of help people get into shelter and provide enough shelter for people to use. So how is that going? Because that's held up as a model here, where there's, as I understand the numbers, you have more homeless in New York City than certainly we have, between Los Angeles and San Francisco and the Bay Area. But in our region, 75% or more of the homeless population is unsheltered, where the number in New York, we understand, is around 5%. So 5% to 75% is a pretty big gap. So, how does that work? And if there's shelter, why not get folks into shelter?
Again, if a population, and this is the single population that is, that used to hang out in the Bowery back in the day, that population, if they don't want to be in shelter, if they want to be on the streets for whatever reason, fear of the shelters or just mental illness that makes them not want to be around people, the police cannot legally take them to a shelter unless there's a threat to the public safety. So that's a problem. And our right to shelter is an obligation for the government. So the right to shelter really forces the government to spend a lot of money creating shelters. We've got about 60,000, more than 60,000 families with children in shelters now. And throughout the pandemic, we're at a very high, it's a very high level for us to have that number of families in shelter. And that's a problem that has to be addressed through restoring, the plan is to restore payments, rent payments, to keep people in their apartments so they're not evicted. So it's an anti-eviction strategy that's being put in place with regard to family homelessness, and trying to, and raising the, we've got a program that pays rent, but it doesn't pay enough rent for a homeless family to get them out of shelter and into a private apartment. And what they're working on is to raise that rent to a market rent so that you can get a 2-bedroom apartment in New York for, so that the government is going to pay basically to get them out. But that will save us money because family shelters cost us so much. All the shelters cost so much on the homeless. So it's a priority. We're working on it, but it is, it's very complicated to solve.
Yeah, well.
And the right to shelter is not, it doesn't solve anything. It just puts more obligation on the government, and depending on how effective they are at responding to that obligation is how successful you are. And, you know, that's a very mixed bag.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a question from James Lee about food insecurity. Mentions that Alameda County here has done a great job over 12 months. Anything on making sure people in New York are able to access food during the pandemic, especially?
There was a tremendous effort. In fact, Kathryn Garcia, who was the runner-up as mayor, was our food czar. And she mobilized, and they were serving literally millions of meals. They were quadrupling what we had done through food pantries and other places before the pandemic. So both from the government and from the nonprofit sector, there were that was a very successful effort throughout the pandemic. And we had, you know, the restaurants, the government was actually paying the restaurants, and philanthropy was paying the restaurants to make food and provide it for folks that were needy and for during the pandemic. So I think the food thing, we did better during the pandemic than we did before. The question is what will we do after? How will we keep this going? Because the problem doesn't go away. It was much more severe during the pandemic, but it's going to be an ongoing problem. And at this point, I don't think we have figured that out, because FEMA obviously helped us pay for a lot of what was mobilized during the pandemic, and we don't expect to see more FEMA funds. I have no idea. I mean, it's an interesting question with PPP loans for small business, with the food issues, the whole set of issues surrounding what the federal government sent us a lot of resources, thinking the pandemic was going to be over like a year ago.
Yeah.
So,
how much appetite do they have?
I haven't heard anybody say, what if this goes on for another year and nobody can go back, and, you know, we have to go into lockdown again. I haven't heard anybody offering up another $1 trillion.
Well, I'm sure that the hands will be out. I know for our transit agencies, there's a cliff around 2024. So we've got a lot of trains and buses running without passengers, but at some point, you know, there's only so much to that. And speaking of food security, I could really use a couple of slices of Joe's Pizza if you could do something about that. Catherine August asked the question, and I think you touched on in the beginning, on Omicron and, you know, and return to work. So how much do you think that the new variant will impact the plans of companies to get people, you know, either ones that have already returned or ones that were thinking about it?
It depends on what happens over the holidays and what we see in January. If the numbers keep shooting up, it's going to severely break the momentum of return to the office. As I said, we were hoping on having 50% back on the average day by the end of January 2022. It's a big question. Many people are now going, extending the remote period through the Christmas holidays and beyond and trying to figure it out. So I don't think there's any way to predict until we know what's going to happen. Our hospitalizations are way up too, and I assume that's Delta, but it's a great unknown. It certainly is not helping recovery.
In terms of congestion management, there was a question from Cliff Waldeck about picking some days in which we extend bus routes here all the way in the city because some of them have been cut back. But applied to New York, when you say that companies are going to go back 3 or 4, workers are going to go back 3 or 4 days a week, and we see the same thing here where the magic number seems to be 3, but who knows? Have you thought about trying to get the companies to spread it out so that they're not Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and so we're empty Monday, Friday, and then we've got a mass of humanity in the middle of the week?
I think most companies are trying to do that. I've heard many companies say you can be 3 days a week, but it can't be Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So I think that's just for the sake of the company. They want their people staggered so that they can plan or have some plans around that. So I haven't, we're just not at that. We were reaching the point where we were planning for how we were going to deal with the post-COVID era on issues like this and conversion of office buildings to residential, and we passed a bill about how to make about making restaurants in the streets and sidewalks permanent, giving them that option on a permanent basis, but it was going to require design standards, and it was going to require them to pay rent to the city, and some other things. Everything is on hold.
Yeah, we have the same issues. We want to make it permanent, but we want you to jump through all kinds of hoops to get it. And then the restaurants say, enough, I'll close the darn thing, because I want to focus on a friend of mine introduced by former Mayor Willie Brown, is a fellow named Vincent Thomas. I don't know whether he's from New York. I think he's a New Yorker, but he spends half his time here. And he has the notion that we should be, and he has a question in the chat about how we as Californians and Bay Areans and New York can actually work together, given the importance of our relevant economy. So if we could flash on Vincent for a second, I think he could ask this question better than I could frame it. But we've actually been working with him to see if we can maybe create some analysis around exactly how tied together our economies are. Vincent Thomas, explain yourself, sir.
Yes, hi. Ms. Wylde, how are you?
Hi, good, thank you, Kathy.
I've been in New York State since 1986, working in the state legislature, working for the Department of Economic Development, and doing just various consulting things, basically since I guess probably about '98, exclusively out of Albany. So one of the things that happened was we organized a trip for the Speaker of the Assembly, Carl Hastie, to visit the Bay Area in 2017. He was hosted by former Mayor Willie Brown. And out of that experience came a lot of thinking about how can we formally and create a think tank-like structure to effectively take advantage of the synergies between New York and the Bay Area. And I'll just read the question. Given the uncertainties of the post-COVID living and working patterns, along with the uncertainties of partnerships with the federal government, what ongoing strategies should states with the 5th and 12th largest global economies pursue to maintain and grow the economic success that they have already obtained? In particular, what should private business organizations like the Council and the Partnership do together to ensure the kind of robust economic growth that both areas have seen happen naturally continue with active pursuit of policies that are of mutual benefit?
Well said. And I'll point out that California is the one that's 5th in the total economy world scheme. But let's have Kathryn respond.
So we have certainly had relationships over the years, both in terms of communicating on key issues. When Mike Bloomberg was mayor, he set up something with the then mayor of San Francisco, whose name I'm forgetting, who died suddenly.
Ed Lee, yeah.
Yes, Ed Lee and Eric Schmidt, and they had a meeting, and it was basically around the tech economy issues. And they would twice a year, they would either meet in New York, or they'd meet once in New York, once in San Francisco every year. And I think that was a very important conversation, because we were benefiting a lot from learning about the innovation economy from you all, and the two mayors were communicating on a regular basis. Nothing has really replaced that during the last 8 years of the de Blasio administration, and that has left a vacuum. Now, Eric Adams has welcomed Mike Bloomberg back into City Hall and is very much collaborating with him. And so that might be a forum, Bloomberg Associates, and that have a think tank that hasn't done any business in New York since Mike was banished from City Hall by de Blasio. So that might be a place, and I can certainly raise with them, with the Bloomberg Foundation and Bloomberg Associates. I don't know if they've done any work in San Francisco or not. They have done a lot of work in Los Angeles.
Yeah, we certainly work closely with the Bloomberg folks. So they're they're very present folks, administration here, and have their big news company, and so they're very involved here.
Yeah, Vincent, I don't know if that works for you, but that seems to me like the fastest, most efficient way to see if there's something to put together along the lines that you're speaking about.
Well, let's. I'm gonna kick it back to Jim, because there's some things in the works. There is a publication being prepared to look at the Bay Area and New York from the vantage point of the tech economy, and the interesting thing that I've discovered is that the level of investment that goes between the Bay Area and invests in New York City, and from New York City that invests in the Bay Area, is a tremendous number. And the level of synergies that come from that are important. I think one of the things is that I would say is that I have always seen this as not a government to government think tank. Now, I've worked in government think tanks. I was a staff analyst for the Governor's Telecommunications Exchange in the 90s, before all the bells and whistles that we're using right now were even thought of. So I understand what government can do, and I'm thinking of this more in terms of being led by the private sector organizations.
Well, Vincent, we only have a few minutes left. I'll just respond quickly that we do, the Bay Area Council has conducted quite a number of studies in which we look at the Bay Area, sometimes California, and China, Canada, Mexico, Japan, to see the European Union, just Australia, just to see where the fits and starts are, where the potentials are for some economic development between both. And so we've never looked at another region of the United States, but what we're looking at is, Kathryn, is maybe doing something like that. And if so, we'd love to work with you, because in order to do it, we need to meet with the companies and get, we need both data and anecdotal information about how this fertilization can take place. So Vincent, thank you for raising it. We appreciate it. It's good to see you, my friend. And onward.
Thank you very much.
So, Kathryn, talk a little bit. We have a few minutes left, and I think Vincent's question raised, and your response raised the question about the nature of the New York economy. And so we have seen Google and Facebook and Amazon see New York as a place for future growth and to achieve talent and scale. What do you think about the New York economy, pandemic aside for a moment, when you think of the future? Venture capital, major tech companies, back to finance and Wall Street. Where do you see the future of New York's economy going?
So our economy is still overwhelmingly driven by the financial sector broadly, not just banks, but private equity, insurance, and increasingly fintech, where we've, over the last 15 years, developed a very strong fintech cluster here. So tech is our high growth area, but it's still a small portion of the economy compared to financial and professional services in terms of both jobs and economic output. So, and by the way, our economy did very well throughout the pandemic. Our losses were only about 3% of our economic output, and that was concentrated in the brick and mortar economy, the tourism sector, retail, Broadway. But in terms of financial services, professional services, technology, off the charts, and grocery stores, of course. So our economy is strong right now. Our concern is that post-pandemic, our tax base is going to erode substantially because of remote work, of people relocating, because of our taxes being the highest in the nation. We raised taxes during the pandemic unnecessarily because we got enough federal funds to pay for what we had to do. So it was pure political punishment for rich people. That does not go over big, as you know. That causes people to think about their options. So we've had a lot of people move out of the city to suburban New York, to New Jersey, which also raises taxes during the COVID, to Connecticut. And I've had 4 billionaires on my board relocate permanently to Florida. So, and say they had to resign from my board because it was too much nexus with New York and the tax bill. So it's a serious issue.
Yeah, we're certainly seeing the same. And every time we turn around, there's another proposal. I'm sure this year's legislature, which is about to convene, will have some real doozies, but taxing unrealized capital gains, taxing worldwide income. San Francisco passed a tax on if CEOs make too much more money than the average workers, then that's a special tax on that. And if you can't nail it down, tax it. There's going to be a few more initiatives on the state ballot next year to just tax personal income, capital income, and so forth. So we're constantly, I think our two, in common is our two states are coming up with great ideas for how to make it less comfortable for people who contribute to the economy to stay in the place. And unfortunately, I don't know, fortunately or unfortunately, in California, we had a record surplus budget of $85 billion, give or take, when we predicted 54 billion deficit. So a record off the chart surplus. And so the answer is, what problem? What? So I call it sort of the Alfred E. Newman approach to governing. And underneath this all, we see some, real challenges. Kathryn, it's always great to see you, and I look forward to seeing you in person again one of these days. And in the meantime, let's take Vincent up on his challenge and think about maybe some ways. Certainly state and local taxes is just, I think, an example of maybe some of the things we could be thinking about together strategically with our rather potent economies behind us. So thank you for participating. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for the opportunity, and happy holidays.
Happy holidays to you and to all of your members.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.